Today's show is brought to you by the good folks at Black-Throated Mercantile. From the mighty high heights of 7,083 feet above mean sea level in Salida, Colorado, Black-Throated Mercantile is making fantastic hats. From dead lot to your head, go get you one. All right, cats, I got something different for you today. We're going through the bibliography list and the required reading list for Crazy Legs Grateful Dead University self-study course. I've been at this for a long time. The tone chasing, the research, whatever you want to call it. The Grateful Dead have been my favorite band since 6th grade. I'm 46 now. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about it. Spent a lot of time reading about it. And back in the day when there wasn't really any internet, I would buy books and continue to buy books until basically, this week. It's a favorite topic of mine, and I'm going to share with you some of my favorite reading that my favorite reading collection from over the years. So without further ado, this is Crazy Legs required reading list. Here we go. Okay, so the first piece that anybody needs to, any aspiring Deadhead scholar needs is a good copy of Dead Bass. I got this one at Now and Then Records in New Hope, Pennsylvania, probably around 1992 or 93, probably 93 actually, definitely 93. It wasn't 92, and I'll tell you why about that. First, a little bit of history. Dead Bass started in 1987. Stu Allen, John W. Scott, and Mike Dolgushkin got together with the endorsement of the Grateful Dead. They were introduced by Dennis McNally, the band's publicist, and they began compiling a comprehensive database of the Grateful Dead performances, the known shows and set lists all the way back to the beginning. This is Dead Bass 7, and it goes up through December 17th, 1992. So this book was published in a living, breathing Grateful Dead world. I continue to consult it, believe it or not. I know all this stuff is on the internet, but something about the tactile quality of going through the pages and finding the shows for like a listening project last year. I listened to every Philadelphia Grateful Dead show. I'm from Philly, and I just thought that would be cool to be, to listen to every note of music that the Dead played in the city. It was sort of a way into the catalog. And I used the Dead Bass for it to find the shows. So so there's the database of the shows, and that looks like this. Right? It gives you the date, it gives you the venue, and it gives you the city. And then it also gives you the night of the week. And then, of course, the set list. So, like, back in the day when it was just tapes, the classic way to label your tapes would be date, 12/9/79, venue, Kiel Auditorium, and then the city, St. Louis, Missouri. That's how all my tapes read across the back. You kind of wanted to have it uniform so that you could find everything in the big stack. But, the obsessive kind of nature of this lends itself to doing everything the same way every time. And I trace that back to the way that these guys organized it in this book. There's relevant information, Billy Kreutzmann's birthday. I don't know, just different little nuggets. Sometimes they include the opening band. They include special guests. But another section of this book I really like is, in my edition, it's found on page 215. That's Every Time Played. Hopefully that focused. Every Time Played shows all the songs and what song they were playing before, and then what song came after it. So Loser, for example, was first performed on February 18th, 1971. It came after It's the first one. There was 644 performances before this one, and it came after Hurts Me Too and before Greatest Story Ever Told. So, for the statistician in us, it's a pretty good little resource. I was talking to a buddy of mine about what made the Barton Hall 77 show, the Cornell performance, so special. And my contention, in addition to just being really well played, really kind of interesting, is that they played St. Stephen that night. And I was like, probably the only time they played it on that tour. Turns out it's like not the only time they played it. Maybe on the tour or, well, let's look it up right now. Let's see. Yeah, so here we go. Here's the 77 St. Stephen's. They played it on February 27th. That's the swing. They played it on 4:30. They played it on 5/5/77. They played it on 5/8/77. They played it on 5/15/77. They played it on 5/21/77. So a bunch. They played it a bunch on that tour. It was not really a rarity. Stupid me. I thought it was. I hadn't committed to memory, shockingly, all the sets they played in May of 77. So anyway, St. Stephen is not what makes that show special, it turns out. And there's some other stuff in here too. There's great reviews by noteworthy people. This was like the backbone of the taping community, and the taping community. There's like a whole other video to be made about that. Honestly, I don't really know a ton about it because a lot of those guys are like my dad's age that were trading tapes and establishing the network, back in the early 70s. But some of those guys are in here. There's interviews from them, and it's interesting to read. So Dead Bass is go get you a copy, man. This is my pretty well torn up. I've had this since high school. It was out of my hands for a long time. My good friend, old roommate, and just cosmic shaman partner Dan Black had it at his place up in Vermont for a long time. And I was reunited with this probably back in around 2012. So anyway, Dead Bass. This is Dead Bass 7. Okay, so speaking of McNally, this is his seminal offering on the Grateful Dead, A Long Strange Trip. Dennis McNally was the band's publicist. He got that job by mailing a copy of his biography of Jack Kerouac to the Grateful Dead office at 5th and Lincoln in San Rafael, and ended up getting hired and being the publicist of the group. This is a very comprehensive biography of the band. It's the kind of first and last word on the Grateful Dead from a historical standpoint. It talks about the origins of the band members and how they got together. And then, there's just great anecdotal stories all the way through this. It's a fantastic read. I really can't recommend it enough. It came out in the early 2000s, probably 2003 or so. He did a book tour. He was on NPR being interviewed about it. It was a big deal when it came out. And to be completely frank with you, my interest in tone chasing kind of traces its roots back to this book. This came out right at the same time when high-speed internet was sort of readily available, and this was right when I found my way to the forum culture, Are You Kind, and Dozen's website, and all that stuff. And I had always been curious about Jerry's sound, and I was learning how to play electric guitar, and I couldn't figure out how Garcia sounded that way because none of the amp guitar combinations I was plugging into at Guitar Center were giving me this really kind of crackly, clear guitar sound. So I'll just read you a little section here. He's talking about, this is from the introduction. This is how the book begins. It's called Introduction, Power, the Stage as Alembic, mid-1980s. So right in the sweet spot for me. From the top of the center rear stage stairs, you stand behind and between two glistening drum sets that anchor the setup. At far left front of stage sit Brent Midland's B3 organ, a Yamaha synthesizer, and his own small mixing board. Next to Midland's corner, moving forward towards the center, is guitarist Jerry Garcia's equipment cabinet, essentially a frame that holds a sound effect rack, a preamplifier, a Macintosh MC2300 amplifier, 4 JBL speakers, a floor strip with 2 foot pedals and 7 switches labeled Mutron, Oct, Boss, Wah, Dist, Phase, Delay. It sits in front of Garcia's vocal microphone. So that's kind of laying out in Jerry's setup. And that was really the first I had considered it. Anyway, Long Strange Strip, required reading. This is a great book. I really can't recommend it highly enough. McNally's a super interesting guy. He's all over the Long Strange Strip documentary that is on Amazon Prime. If you haven't seen that, you know what to do with that. Oh, before we go any further, please don't forget to subscribe. We are finding an audience, so let's help more people find the channel, inform the algorithm we're all interested, and knock out the subscribe button. You know what to do there. Okay. The third book on my list is Heads by Jesse Jarnow. Jesse is a friend and one of the hosts of the good old Grateful Dead podcast. If you're not listening to that, hit the pause button and find that in a podcatcher and dive right in because it's fantastic. So Heads is a biography of psychedelic America, and it talks about the psychedelic movement, but it's told the vehicle for the narrative is the Grateful Dead. Go figure. And it is just fantastic. All of the major cats figure into this story. Dick Lotvala is in here. Jerry Moore and Harvey Luber of the Tape Club from the Bronx are talked about in here. There's just a ton of good information. He goes deep into, he goes deep into a lot of things. Keith Haring, turns out he was a Deadhead, sold the first merch he ever sold was on Deadlot in Philly. It turns out he made t-shirts with his kind of iconic, design. Just a lot of great stories about going through time, from the mid 60s all the way to the present day. He talks about the Wetlands Preserve in New York, gets into discussing just a bunch of cool stuff. And it is a really, really good read. I can't recommend this highly enough. It's available in paperback, and I understand on Audible too, if you want it to be read to you. That is also an option. So Heads, that can't say enough good things about that book. David Gans, host of the Grateful Dead Hour, host of the Tales from the Golden Road, along with Gary Lambert on the Sirius satellite radio. He's also a music journalist. He freelanced, I think, on the West Coast. Had some pieces in Rolling Stone, and at some point put out this book called Conversations with the Dead. The Grateful Dead podcast is what hipped me to this book because Jarnow just talks about this in glowing terms, and I thought I had better have a look for myself. And guess what? It's great. He's got all the heavy hitters in here. There is a fantastic interview with Garcia talking about like what books he's reading on the road in the 80s. He was really into like the occult, it turns out. It's great. That interview alone is great. There's a really good section where he talks about the onboard effects loop in the guitar, and I'm going to do an episode dedicated to the onboard effects loop, and we'll be talking about that interview. Healy is in here. He interviews Phil Lesh. He interviews Weir. He interviews Barlow, and then really I think kind of the best get of the whole thing is a really lengthy interview from the early 90s with Owsley Stanley, Bear. And and can't forget Robert Hunter also turns up from a K-Fog interview that was on the air in San Francisco, January 10th, 1986. Yeah, it's a fantastic time capsule. The interviews stand up really well. It doesn't seem dated at all. It is a behind the curtain peek into what was going on, in the minds of the guys in the band and the periphery of the band members. I would include, Healy and Barlow and of course Hunter in that really tight inner circle of Grateful Dead world. So yeah, great read. Not a whole lot else to say about it. It's an interview book, so there's not really a narrative, but you just kind of hang in and enjoy. Okay, this one I've had for a long time, and it's called Garcia, A Signpost to New Space, Jerry Garcia, Charles Reich, and Jan Werner. This is a couple of interviews from Garcia's house in Stinson Beach in Marin County in the early 70s, right around the Working Man's Dead, American Beauty, probably 1970, I think, is when this came out, or when the interviews took place. Yeah. Anyway, it's it's a trip. Garcia, we're kind of coming out of the real like flower power 1960s, and it is a time capsule of this kind of hippie nomenclature, that vernacular that Garcia was speaking in back then. I mean, he would talk about flashing on things. I'm not even really entirely sure what the fuck that means, but I flashed on this scene, or I think he's saying like, I thought about this, or I had this thought occur to me, but he's got this like really groovy way of talking, and that sort of fell by the way. So he's a young guy, you know what I mean? He's in his I guess late 20s when he's being interviewed by the founder of this up and coming upstart publication, Rolling Stone. And then this other cat, Charles Reich, is a Yale professor. So it's just a very unlikely discussion. It's a very unlikely grouping of people talking to one another. I found it to be really delightful. There's not, I wouldn't say that there's like a whole lot to be gleaned out of this, other than you're like a fly on the wall, in a pretty lovely afternoon in Stinson Beach, on a nice day, basically. So yeah, kind of a time capsule read, but a good one nonetheless. I'm making it. I'm sounding dismissive about that. It's not. I took the time to read it. It is a really good book. But in terms of like the nuts and bolts of like the historical record, it's not really that kind of read. It's more like a Deadhead on the beach kind of a read, if you can dig that. All right. So speaking of Rolling Stone, this book is the hardbound cover published by Rolling Stone called Garcia, and this came out in probably 1996. It's a collection of all of the Rolling Stone pieces about Jerry Garcia, all the interviews they did with him over the years that were published in the magazine. I kind of just keep this as a coffee table book. This takes me back to that time in the second half of the 90s after Garcia died, and it was profoundly sad. I mean, it was, for me, it was like a death in the family, it was really, really sad when Jerry died. I don't know if that can be overstated enough. I mean, it's certainly an obvious thing, but like at the time, I had been out on the road seeing the band a ton. I saw him in California in 95. I traveled all over the place to see him. And I was 19, I was kind of in the middle of that Kerouacian on the road experience, the adventure of being young and cut loose in America. And it came to a screeching halt. 95 was a weird year. The shows were not very good. There was some bright spots, but largely it seemed like Jerry was really sick. It seemed like he was going to get better because this had happened in the past, right? But he didn't. And there was some grieving to be done after his passing. And this book really takes me back to that time and place when there was just a hole in the, in kind of the cosmic ether. And it was really hard to wrap your head around it. Now time has passed and it's kind of all good in the hood and we're living through this sort of rebirth of interest in the band, deep into this era of rebirth of interest in the band. And it's wonderful, but we had to go through this grieving period. And anyway, this book came out right in the middle of that. And it really does remind me of that period, the post, the second half of the 90s. And my God, what next? What am I going to do with my life? Yeah. So I've gone back and read a couple of the interviews. I have not read this thing cover to cover, but yeah, it's a good one to have. I got this on eBay, and because I wanted a hardcover, book to kind of mark the occasion and something to hang on to. All right, this classic, The Grateful Dead Family Album by Jerry Lynn Brandeis. I'm sorry, I'm probably butchering that name. Jerry Lee Lynn Brandeis passed a few years ago. The significance of this book is that back in the day, I know you're probably sick of hearing what it was like in the dark ages before the internet, right? But that's kind of the interesting thing about the Dead is that they ended right when the internet started. So there was not a lot of information. I mean, if you read the books, it makes it seem like In the Dark came out in 87, then all of a sudden the Dead were this super popular thing and they were everywhere and the concerts were packed and you couldn't get tickets. That's all true, but they still were very much like an unknown quantity in pop culture. They were not talked about really a lot. They weren't really on magazine covers. I mean, they're here and there a little bit, but not the way, I don't know, Madonna was at the time or MJ or they weren't selling those kind of units. They didn't garner that level of media attention. So if you're a kid like me, a teenager who's curious, there's not a whole lot to go on. This is one of the only things that was out there. This is the Grateful Dead Family Album, and it's kind of this like cool collage-y looking thing where there's some interviews and there's a lot of great pictures, and they talk about the roadies, they talk about Pigpen, Keith and Donna, all this sort of like background information. Again, like for me as 13, 14-year-old, Donna is in the way rearview mirror. Pigpen is long dead. And, there wasn't, this is how I found out about all those characters. And there's just great pictures, really, really great pictures. I wish I knew more about the author. I wish I knew more about how this book was constructed. I probably could have done a modicum of research about it, but I just love looking at it. It's one of those books that, if you would go to the rental bro house in the ski town, this would be sitting on top of the toilet or on the coffee table or someplace, a well-worn copy of this would just be around. And it's that kind of read, you just kind of pick it up and read a little bit about Round Records rather. Or there's a section here about Hard Truckers and how they built the speaker cabinets for the Wall of Sound. Yeah, it's super cool. If you can find a copy on eBay, grab one. It's a great read, and you should really have one for yourself. Okay, so that book kind of has a partner. These aren't related. This is the Grateful Dead Playing in the Band, an oral and visual portrait by David Gans, once again, and Peter Simon. This came out also in the mid-'80s and is sort of in that same magazine-y sort of milieu, I guess. A lot of these great pictures that we know and love are in here, but there's also some other ones that you don't really find anywhere else. They talk about the band members. They talk about going on the road. I think this was the first time I had seen this picture of Jerry in his Fender Tweed briefcase getting on a helicopter. Turns out they were headed to the US Festival in '82, where they played, I think, at 9 in the morning or something ridiculous. Oh yeah, this awesome picture of Steve Martin and Jerry playing banjo. Love that one. Yeah. It's another offering from David Gans. It has got this just crazy cover shot of the band with the motorcycle. And probably 1984, I guess, is when that was taken. Phil is in the middle of the bell curve of the Heineken years and back, looking like he really does not want to be there. Anyhow, yeah, playing in the band. This is another one you kind of got to have, I think, if you want to have a complete collection. We've talked about this work before. Blair Jackson's Grateful Dead gear. I've been through this a bunch. It's kind of what I've used to research some of the videos here on the show. And it's a really great nuts and bolts historical top-down view of the band and the gear, the guitars, the amps they were using throughout the years. It's published by Backbeat Books, who also put out the Beatles gear book and the Rolling Stones gear book. Both also are top tier. If you like guitars and gear and stuff like that, all three are a great read. I don't know what else there is to say. Blair Jackson is a journalist, Bay Area based, I believe, was Bay Area based. He's from the East Coast, and a great guy, and a colossal Deadhead who's been out there seeing the shows, seeing the band since the early 70s, and has got just a lot of experience, and is a great writer too. It covers all the relevant information, all the stuff that you kind of need to know. There's a really great chapter on the Wall of Sound, great stuff about the Irwin guitars, Macintosh, so on and so forth. Yeah, Grateful Dead gear, still in print, I think. Definitely grab one. Okay, these two books I'm going to talk about at the same time because I think of them as their authors as very related. This is Just Jerry by Bob Minkin, and this is Between Dark and Light, the Grateful Dead photography of Jay Blakesberg. Now, both of these guys are kind of like the Coke and Pepsi of a Grateful Dead photography. They're both East Coast guys who kind of came up congruently, starting in the late 70s and all the way through to 95. Both made a career of photojournalism and got their start shooting the Grateful Dead from a fan's eye perspective, selling their photos on the lot. And we're sort of a face in the crowd. Maybe, I'm not sure about sneaking cameras in, but just started shooting pictures of the band based on the shows that they were at. And it is fantastic. There's documentation, the first Bob was there the first time the Dead played Madison Square Garden. And there's Jay was doing tour in, I think, 1980. And there's great shots of, 79 at Hampton, Rochester, September 1st, 79. If you like the guitars, you like the gear shots, they're all in here. The Jerry Band performances from Broadway. Jay eventually settled on the West Coast, as did Bob. And then we're sort of at all of the West Coast gigs right up to the end. I've got a picture hanging on my wall from Bob Minkin, from Jerry, looking down on us in 1983 from Shoreline. And Bob was nice enough to have me over to his house one time in Marin County. And is just a great dude. He is a great hang. I've never met Jay, but I hope to someday. Yeah, these are great books. They're great reads. Bob also has a book called Just Bobby. I haven't bought that one yet, but soon. I'm gonna have it soon. I have no weird bias, and there's great pictures in there, and I'll have that on my bookshelf too. These are two of the guys that, like, all of the photos you see on the internet, not all, but a lot of them were shot by these two. There's other Grateful Dead photographers too, that were also doing the same thing, selling the shots on Dead Images springs to mind. Both of these guys are their photos are all over the internet. And one thing, I just need to get on my soapbox here for 1 second. One thing that absolutely drives me insane is that when people screenshot stuff and then post it on Instagram and don't credit the photographers. These two guys ground it out to get these pictures, and they deserve every ounce of credit that is due to them for capturing those shots, for being there, for being the person that thought ahead to buy the film, get it developed, get the camera into the venue, get the press pass, whatever. And they deserve every red cent and every bit of credit that is due to them. So please, when you post pictures, credit the photographers. Okay, that is a real. That is something I have been schooled on, and I'm glad that I was schooled on it because it's really, really important. And there's a lot of other great Grateful Dead photographers out there who have not published books, whose works need to be credited as well. Okay, there's an honorable mention. Unfortunately, I don't have a copy of this anymore, but there was in the November 18th, 2012 edition of the New Yorker magazine, Nick Paumgarten published an article called Deadhead. Nick Paumgarten is the guy who's in the Amir Bar-Lev Long Strange Trip documentary, who's busting out his old tapes and playing them for you. He talks about tapers. He talks about going to shows in the 80s and is really well spoken. It turns out he's a New Yorker writer, and a Deadhead. And man, this article is so good. It sort of follows the story of finding some Betty boards that Rob Eaton from the Dark Star Orchestra discovered. He figures into the narrative. David Lemieux shows up. They ride around in a car together. One part of the story that I find very relatable is Nick is playing a particular Scarlet Fire from the Fox Theater in Atlanta and trying to kind of tease. It's trying to get Lemieux to appreciate how great it is. It turns out that show was later put out as a Dave's pick, so David definitely did grab the significance of it and agree, and it got its moment in the sun. But in the article, it doesn't really go that way, so you got to read it to catch that moment. And I've been that guy who's like trying to play something like, you got to hear this, and this is great for this reason, and your friend is not really feeling the same vibe. Deadhead in the New Yorker by Nick Paumgarten. You can find it online. I'm going to put a link to that article in the description. Definitely check it out. It's a classic, like, New Yorker treatment, really long read, but just awesome. Okay, so moving chronologically, the last book I have here came out last year. This book caused a pretty big stir in the Deadhead scene after all is said and done. Mark A. Rodriguez. It is a collection of tape art, which is pretty interesting from a collection point of view. I mean, having lived through the taper era and been a tape collector myself, I don't find the fetishization of tapes that interesting. They were conduits to the music to me. It was just, it was a tape. I cared a lot more about the sound quality, and if there was a lot of hiss, or if it was an audience or a soundboard, stuff like that. The art associated with it did not always factor into my decision making about whether or not I would buy the tape, or excuse me, if I would copy the tape and add it to my collection. However, there's a lot of interesting stuff about tape art, and he kind of goes way deep in it. And then the second half is these fantastic interviews, like Dick Lockvala has an interview in here. David Lemieux is in here. Ed Perlstein. These are like heavy hitter tape collectors. And reading through what they have to say about collecting and the Grateful Dead in general is super duper interesting. So it's a really good read. That's what I got. It's a little different. No music today. We're just kind of talking about books and nerding out a little bit. If this speaks to you, if this kind of content is what you're into, stick around. We're going to post some more. I'd like to talk more about some thoughts on the Grateful Dead and how I got to where I am with it. And I'm having some positive feedback. I hope you're enjoying the show. You can follow me on Instagram at CrazyLegsCabs. We're going to be launching a website here in the coming weeks so that you can order your own cabinet. And yeah, that's what I got, guys. Have a great day. Thanks so much for watching. If you stuck into the end, man, good on you. All right, we'll see you next time, cats. Take care.